Just look at each other. Good evening. I'm Mark Harris. Welcome to Season 5 of DiversiTV. If you are returning, part of our returning audience, welcome back. If you are just tuning in for the first time, welcome. Our seasons roughly correspond to the terms. This is the fifth term that we've been doing this in a row. Next term, you'll be able to actually take this for either continuing education credit or counseling psych credit next term as an experimental class. DiversiTV's mission, if we go to slide, if you will, is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. And so to that end, our episodes, basically, we always start, since we're on Turtle Island, we always start with a native perspective, then to give context to Anglo, then Africans in America, Latino, Asian, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersexed, two-spirit perspective, disability, youth, class, and December 10th we'll end with spirituality and religion. And the schedule can change based on guest availability, but basically we always go in this order to maintain some consistency. One of the reasons that we start with natives, and basically the word Tulipit Wapakisinap, I'm not sure which specific language that is, but it's one of the indigenous names for the continent. The idea is the long-reaching land, or Turtle Island, that is the landmass referred to as North, Central, and South America, one continuous landmass. One of the things we look at this month is what we refer to in ethnic studies, and I refer to in my classes, as the Taino first contact of Cristobal Colon on Guanahani Island, which is usually characterized as Columbus discovers America. Well, the Taino nation makes first contact with Cristobal Colon, an Italian sailor who's employed by the Spanish government. And his actual name, Colon, not Columbus, is where we get the process of colonization. So colonization requires the destruction of indigenous people and their reconstruction in the image of Western civilization. So there are lots of different approaches to this, and sometimes over my training career, one of the things we've talked about when we've looked at this from a substance abuse prevention perspective, when we've created trainings that are culturally specific, one of our elders talked about 3 tests being brought to Indian people: the Bible, the bottle, the casino. The goal of each one of those tests, or Trojan horses, if you will, is to break apart the Indian world, to kill the Indian and save the man, as it were. So the idea of a Trojan horse is it's a weapon disguised as a gift. And one of the slides that came from the Gona is looking at the things and factors that broke apart our Indian world, where there was loss of language, culture, history with using alcohol as a weapon, organized religion. Various people have talked about multi-generational trauma and boarding school experience and other things. So our guest tonight, Tom Ball, who's Modoc Klamath, Assistant Vice Provost in the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity at the University of Oregon, and among many other things, a researcher on the effects of historical trauma and unresolved grief in First Nations people. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
First, how did you come to this work? And you can answer that in any way you want in terms of looking at your cultural identification with the Native nations that you represent.
Okay. Well, first I should introduce myself. My name is Tom Ball. I'm Modoc and Klamath. My Indian name is Daloga Yulalina. It means charges along the edge. My parents are Woody and Lillian Ball. My mother is from Oklahoma, Cherokee, and my father is Klamath and Modoc from the Klamath Reservation. And I'm an enrolled Klamath tribal member. I came to this work actually my first term on tribal council, first meeting I walked into, there's a lot of commotion, a lot of raised voices and excitement, and I went in and asked what was wrong. And they said there's a treatment center, Indian treatment center, that wouldn't take our youth because they said they're too angry. And so we started talking about that on our health committee. Why are our people more angry than even other Indians? The only thing we could come up with was termination, and that we had been terminated. And so
53?
In 1954.
Okay.
And so I wrote a grant to study the effects of termination on our people. It was turned down by Indian Health Service and came back with so much red on it, I thought somebody bled on it. And
wow.
Were mad and called up right away. And they said it was really a good idea, an interesting idea, but we didn't have the expertise, the experts on the research grant, since it was a research grant, principal investigators.
Okay.
And we had 2 tribal members. One was a doctor and one was a psychiatrist, both with research experience, and they said that wasn't enough. And so I asked how many principal investigators were in Northwest, Indian principal investigators, and they said none. And so I got mad and went to school. And
hold on, you just threw out a bunch of stuff there. Let me run this back. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm in alcohol and drugs, as many people know. Mm-hmm. All right, so your treatment center mm-hmm. was saying that your kids,
it was a youth treatment center,
had anger issues and they couldn't treat them, right? And so you identified part of the cause as historical trauma, wrote a grant.
Mm-hmm. And termination trauma.
Termination trauma.
I hadn't got on to historical trauma yet.
Okay. All right. And they said, well, even though you had a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, whether or not they were Native, you didn't mention that. But
both tribal members.
Both tribal members. So both indigenous, trained in the Western way, mm-hmm. right? And they weren't sufficient, and there was nobody trained that they recognized in the area.
Mm-hmm. Native people.
Native people.
Mm-hmm. In the Northwest. And that was in 1992, I think.
Okay.
1990.
Okay. So you got mad and got your own Ph.D.
And studied termination trauma.
Okay.
So that's how I got onto it. There were some clues. That was one of them. The treatment center wouldn't take our kids because they're too angry.
Okay.
Angrier than other Indian kids. The other one was I was in Portland working, and we had 12 Klamath tribal members die in 1 year in Portland. In Portland, there's only about 400 tribal members, and they died from being run over, being pushed or jumped in front of a car, stabbed, beaten to death, overdoses. And there was only one that was natural death, natural causes. So we started looking at that. Why are our people dying at these rates? Because they're young people for the most part. Right. The other one was my wife worked in a treatment center, adult treatment center, Indian treatment center in Portland. And she said, you know, the Klamaths are the hardest to work with. She said they come in and they're nice people. You know, they get along really well with everybody. But usually it takes 2 weeks in a treatment center to gain trust when mm-hmm. people start breaking down and trusting their counselors and interacting and engage in treatment. So with the Klamaths, they don't, right up to the last day, they don't engage. So there's trust issues. So there's trust, there's anger, rage, and then the dying at an early age. We started looking at those 3 things. Why are people dying at higher rates than other Indians? Right. Why are they more angry? And why are there trust issues? Okay. About that time, I went to a conference on Ptsd, and it was like a light bulb turned on. Mm. This is our people times 10. Mm-hmm. So that got me on the track to historical trauma. Okay. When I was doing my dissertation on termination trauma, there was, of course, nothing written right. at that time about historical trauma. I started my dissertation, or my PhD program in '93. There was nothing on historical trauma until 1996. There was a book by Eduardo Duran and Bonnie Duran. Native American post-colonial psychology, where they started talking about those things. And it was like a light bulb went on, and that association between PTSD and historical trauma. PTSD being post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. The modern name for
right.
probably an ancient thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that was the first really inkling of what historical trauma was. And it's something we all knew intuitively as Indian people. We talk about that, our past and the effects it has on people that's carried forward. But that was the first time that somebody actually wrote about it and gave us kind of a framework to put things in. And then I took PTSD and looked at that with historical trauma and compared them. And, excuse me, although there's similarities, what we have, historical trauma is much, much, much worse.
Much deeper.
Much deeper.
Yeah.
But PTSD was interesting. It was comes actually from Vietnam vets when they came back from the war, and were victimized or re-victimized by their care providers. And they go in for treatment, and they'd say, well, Mr. Stone, we want to see you. We want to talk about your alcoholism, your rage, and your domestic violence. And he'd start talking about his war experience. They said, no, we want to talk about this. Well, they got mad and left and didn't come back. And a lot of them still living under bridges today because of that. But the same thing happens in our clinics from our own people a lot of times. We go in for treatment. We start talking about something that happened a long time ago, a massacre or prejudice and things like that, and say, no, we want to talk about your alcoholism. Well, same thing happens. Our people get mad and they leave and they don't come back. And so a lot of the negative statistics that we see in our communities, Dr. Duran pointed this out, but can be related right back to the historical traumas that we have. The alcoholism, the suicides, the poverty rates, unemployment, not being able to hold a job, all those things can be traced back to that. And in putting those things in a historical trauma context, for instance, alcoholism, Vietnam veterans went in to get treatment, they didn't get it there, so they left, and not getting treatment, they self-medicated. And to me, that's the same thing, and that's where the simple explanation for alcoholism comes from in our community, that it's more of a self-medication of a soul wound or something that happened.
Self-medication of a soul wound. Okay?
Okay, now, difference between PTSD and historical trauma. A PTSD is like if you and I are driving down the street in a car and we got in a wreck and my arm got cut off, and you had to look at that. 1 out of 4 people would be traumatized by that. That's just a national statistic. Some people have more resiliency or whatever, but 1 out of 4 people would be traumatized by that because it's an event that's so severe or significant that you fear for your own life or somebody else's. So you don't know if I'm going to live. You're lucky. You're just thinking, God, I'm lucky. I'm okay, and feeling, And so that's a trauma. That can trigger a trauma. Or PTSD. The trauma triggers a PTSD. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It has to be triggered by a trauma. And so a trauma triggers that. The difference between PTSD kind of trauma and there's about 13 different things now. It used to be just war trauma. Now there's sexual assault, being in an accident like I just described, being in a house fires, things like that. There's 13 of them, being robbed or mugged. And so the trauma triggers the PTSD, and those are accidental kind of things. They're, for the most part, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Historical trauma, those are things that happen, in our case of indigenous people. They weren't an accident. They happened, happened because of who we are, the color of our skin. And so that does something different to you. PTSD happens right here in your head. Yeah. There's a part of your brain, I can't remember what it is. Yeah. Maybe you know what it is, but.
Yeah. The way you just explained it is similar what I've talked about in terms of training counselors in a context of explaining, okay, so PTSD happens to individuals. Historic or multi-generational trauma happens to a people.
Exactly.
Right?
A group of people.
A group of people. And it can be removed from the individual. So, PTSD happens in my lifetime, in my memory. It could be random, could be deliberate, but it happened to me, and I get re-triggered by the memory. But I guess the way I often explain it, just to put it in context, is even though I grew up in Los Angeles, the sound of a white Southern accent is traumatizing because I sound, that's the enemy. And so even though the stories of, lynchings that occurred in my family and, slavery and all that kind of stuff, that's years and years removed away from me and didn't happen to me, I still get, the vibes, so to speak, from the past. So that's the historical trauma. Those things weren't accidents, even though, and they're separated from my personal experiences of racism, which are also part of the PTSD experience, but also there's historical trauma and grief from that. So PTSD, individuals, historical trauma, people. Yeah.
And when you say that, even though you didn't experience that, it's in your blood. That's what we say, it's in your blood. Right. Now they're proving out with DNA and stuff like that.
Epigenetics,
but that's been said for a long time, it's in your blood. We knew that.
That was our word for it.
It's like a learned experience or shared experience that's transmitted intergenerationally. And in my dissertation, I studied groups that had been, were alive at the time of termination, those that were born after, and even a second generation. And even though it was second generation, 2 generations removed from termination, same symptom. So the same things were found. So what I found was that PTSD, and in reading the research, it's intergenerational and it's cumulative. And so,
what do you mean by cumulative?
Okay, so
because that's powerful and that's important.
Doctors Duran's. The way that they talk about that is wounded seeking wounding. And so what that means is, going back to my example of I had a really good friend that went to Vietnam. He came back really messed up, PTSD. So he comes back from Vietnam. He goes to see his counselor at the VA. Doesn't get what he needs. So he goes out and goes to the bar. And so somebody walks up to him at the bar and says, somebody because he always wore his
jacket,
yeah. So I'm going to go thank that guy. Slaps him on the back, boom, he's on the floor. Cops called, and the cops come in, and so he sees he's controlling the situation, because that's what he sees as a Vietnamese person on the floor, not whoever. It's Viet Cong. And he sees him, and he's controlling the situation. Cops come in, start beating the hell out of him. He turns around and looks at them, and they're in a blue uniform, like the same people that massacred his people back in the day. And so that's another cavalry at Sand Creek, actually. And so that puts him even Cheyenne. Farther. So that's a trauma. Just going through that experience, he re-triggered. Like you said, triggered. So he's re-triggered back to Vietnam. Then he's put back to Sand Creek. Then he gets thrown in jail. All those are traumas, besides his historical trauma. So he gets in jail, and he gets out the next morning and goes home, and his wife's there. Your boss just called, you're fired. You don't have a job. What are you going to? And starts getting in his face. Boom, slaps her.
Yeah.
She takes herself and the child, like she should, and leaves. But that's the 2 people he loves in his life. So they're gone. It's another trauma.
2 major stressors in the same day.
So it's trauma. So what does he do? He can't go back to his counselor because they don't, we want to talk about it. And he's not going back there. He goes back to the bar. And then that cycle just keeps going. Drunk drive tickets, lose your car, lose your insurance. You can't get to work, so you can't get a job, and but that's that wounded seeking wounding. and it just attracts. That's cumulative trauma. It just attracts, and they pile on top of each other. So if you look at historically, from diseases to warfare to treaties to reservation to forced religion, forced education, boarding schools, all those things, termination, boom, 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 it was cumulative. Happened one after the other. We didn't have time to recover. The other thing I found out about PTSD is that it's intergenerational. And they've done studies from Holocaust survivors, grandkids of Holocaust survivors that show PTSD symptoms, even though they know nothing about Holocaust. It's never been told to them. They still show those symptoms. Same with refugees or survivors of Cambodia from the warfare over there. 1 or 2 generations move, they still show those symptoms. So we see that in our communities. You could almost say we're born with it, but again, it's in your blood. It's that DNA. It's in your blood. You're born with that. And so we have all those things. And that gets into the unresolved grief. So what I learned from Dr. Duran, he explained it this way. He said in he's a Western trained psychologist, but he's also Native American. He said in Western trained psychology, what I was taught is like PTSD, it's like a cliff. And you bring your patient up to that cliff, and then you bring them back safely. And you do that over a course of 13 visits. Over a course of 13 visits, they might start talking about that, and in the talking, then they can resolve their issues, or at least feel better about it, and so that's gone away. That's when it happens here. And so what happens with historical trauma, because it's not an accident, comes from here down to here, and it wounds your spirit because it's done to you because of who you are, by somebody that's more powerful. So it wounds your spirit. And so what our ceremonies and what our medical or medicine people do is they take you to that cliff, and then they go over with you, and then bring you back in ceremony and bring you back. And when you go over, that's what touches the spirit and heals the spirit. But that's the difference between a historical trauma and PTSD. And so in my dissertation, that was the first thing I found. Because I couldn't find anything, I started looking at PTSD, and then when I found Duran's book, I said, I started associating them and looking at historical trauma. And when I did my dissertation, I did it on termination of Klamath tribe. Again, a historical trauma. That was something that was done to us. A lot of people think that when we're terminated, we terminated to get money, or voted to terminate. We didn't vote. We only had a vote how we wanted to terminate. They gave us 2 choices how we wanted to terminate.
Can you talk about those 2 choices?
Let's see.
I mean, it's okay, but it's not. It's a false choice. I mean, it's almost like.
Okay. When we were terminated, our tribal council continually went back to Washington, D.C. to fight termination. Our elected leaders did that. My uncle was one of them. Starting from back in 1947 and 1948, they had been trying to terminate us. When it actually started, we went back there and wanted something like termination, but our idea of termination is what self-determination and self-governance is today. We wanted the Bureau of Indian Affairs out of our business, off our reservation. We were paying their way. We're the only tribe in the nation that paid all our own bills. We paid our education, health, roads, everything. We paid our own bills. And so we were doing well, and the superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at that time was a Wade Crawford, and he was a Klamath Indian. And so way back in 1934 with the Indian Reorganization Act, Collier, Senator Collier, championed that act, and that had a lot of reform in education and some other things. Indians were able to get loans, start business, so we had a lot of success with that. Wade Crawford came in at that time, and he was the first Indian superintendent to go and take charge of Bureau of Indian Affairs office at its own reservation, which was the Klamath Reservation. And so he was the poster child kind of for the IRA. Well, when he got to Klamath and Indian politics, we fired him because he, he's working in a bureaucracy and he was a bureaucrat, and it's hard to change a bureaucracy like that. And our people didn't like that, and they fired him. He was very angry over that. So with his success, there were some senators in Arizona and Utah. I can't remember their names now. Watkins, and I can't remember the other guy.
You don't?
No, it was before him.
Okay.
That wanted, they come from Indian states, so there's a lot of backlash. They didn't want to see Indians being that successful. They were getting uppity or whatever.
Yes.
They wanted to squash that. The other thing that was going on at that time was President Eisenhower, what do you call that, communist?
The Red Scare or whatever.
Yeah, the Red Scare was going on. They used that, and they said, well, these Klamath Indians, or all Indians, it's like socialism. They live on a reservation, they live together, they don't have to do this and do this. It's socialism, and that was part of that, and they got some backing for that. We ought to free Indians and let them be like everybody else. Well, we were already like everybody else. We paid taxes, we were citizens, and all that stuff. So they weren't freeing us from anything but our land.
Yeah.
So
that was the idea. That was the game.
Yeah, they free us, get us off the reservation or liquidate our reservation so we're not socialists.
And give like, you a check, maybe.
Yeah, and we're like everybody else.
Right.
And so that was the plan. So anyway, we went back, our elected officials went back to Washington, D.C., and I got the congressional records, and you can read in the congressional records how those senators just browbeat our tribal leaders. Our leaders get up and talk and say we're against termination. They'd browbeat them, cut them off, and just run them off. They brought in Wade Crawford, who was not an elected tribal official. He was just a tribal member. They brought him in, and he was for termination again because he was angry.
Yeah.
And he
getting back at you. It's payback.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so they listened to him, and they used that to get termination.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, they commissioned Stanford University to do a study on termination. Are the Klamath people ready for termination? That report came back and said no, and they'd come up with a list of, I think it was 13 things, a checklist. If you're these things, then you're ready for termination. Yeah. Certain education level, do you understand taxes, can you own, can you manage money, things like that. Well, we failed that test. Stanford gave us that test. We failed that badly. And so they threw that report out.
Naturally. And
then commissioned another report. And so at the time of termination, there was a report about this thick that some people, God, I can't remember what they called that commission, but it was a former senator from Oregon, forgetting his name, but it was in the 50s sometime, who did not like the Klamath tribe and was on record as saying he would get even with the Klamath tribe because there are some roads across our reservation that we butted heads with the state of Oregon over who would manage them or whatever. And he had said at that time that he would get even with the Klamath tribe. Well, him and 3 other people, one was a timber person, like from Weyerhaeuser, and another was a real estate guy from Klamath Falls. So those kind of people put this report together, management report, and it was about this big. Nobody could understand it, and we were told to read that, and this was supposed to tell us how we would be managed if we didn't terminate. So those were our 2 choices. Terminate and take a check now, or stay in under this management plan nobody could understand, and they hadn't even completed who would manage our affairs.
Right, and it probably wouldn't be you. It would probably be them.
Oh, it had to be a trustee.
Yeah.
Indians
a
were
white
smart
trustee.
Enough. Right,
yeah.
Exactly. And so those were our 2 choices, and to withdraw or remain. Withdrawing members and remaining members. 3/4 of the tribe withdrew Like my family, there was 6 kids and our dad. Our dad had our vote. So I was 4 or 5 years old, right in the middle of my family. Right. But he had those votes. And so we were terminated at that time. My uncle, who was on tribal council, remained, and he was chairman of the remaining members while they remained in. Now, that management plan, what it turned out to be, the U.S. Bank, instead of the U.S. government, became that trustee. And so
U.S. Bank?
The U.S. Bank. And they mismanaged things, and our tribal council, executive committee at that time, had a choice. Each 5 years it'd come up and they could re-vote. And so at the end of 10 years, they said, we don't want the U.S. Bank. They're really screwing us over. And so they terminated them. They didn't want termination. They just wanted another trustee. And so they were terminated that time. That ended the termination process. But again, that's something we didn't want from the beginning. It was something that was imposed on us. Even though they said we had a vote, we had people that could not understand. There are some people that understood and wanted the money, but there are people that thought we were just selling the timber because we were the richest timber people in the world. They thought we were just selling the timber. And because Bureau kept screwing us over on timber sales and the money that we were getting, they kept screwing us over, and we sued them a lot of times. But we just wanted to get that, some people said we just wanted to get that done, get the Bureau of Indian Affairs off here, and then manage our own affairs. And that was the understanding of a lot of people at the time. But anyway, that was the termination. That was the 2 votes to withdraw or remain, but not to remain as a tribe, as our own sovereign government.
So we've described a situation of multiple layers of historical trauma reaching to the present day. So what do solutions begin to look like in terms of coming up with, one of the things that when I begin to look at, all 8 of my great-grandparents were half Choctaw. So the family lore is, okay, we're not going on the res. We're going to live and pass for black in all black towns in Louisiana rather than go on the reservation, because cavalry, clan. Let's do the clan, because, that's going to be sporadic. If we stay within our place, we'll be okay, and just, build an identity as almost quasi-urban Indians. I mean, that was part of that history for us. But looking at, as a practitioner, one of the things that I notice is the anger is part of the thing. We don't even deal with the alcoholism. We got to deal with the anger if you're not using, if you're not medicating, right? We got to deal with that and go back as far as we need to begin to resolve that before we can get you to stop using. Put you in touch with and acknowledge that. So what are the things that you start looking at in terms of doing healing and developing your own healing systems?
How much time do we have?
Oh, we got another half hour, 20 minutes, so
right.
Let's go.
Okay. Again, going back to Dr. Duran's example of going over the edge and coming back and healing the spirit.
Yeah.
That's what we're dealing with. And that's where we feel a lot of the negative statistics and things, even diabetes, because that's stress-related, can come from that.
Yeah. Commod food and all that kind of stuff.
All those
being
things.
Separated from our traditional healthy diet.
All those things are right here in your soul wound. I used to work in an alcohol treatment center, and we had a guy that come in every couple times a week, and he'd drum with the clients. And in that treatment center, a lot of guys just got out of prison, buff, big tough guys. First time they hit that drum, boys, just big tears come and start crying. And I looked at that and started thinking about that, and then finally, when I heard Dr. Duran say that, it made sense to me that drum and those songs are something we had at the time of those insults or before. And so your spirit reaches out to that.
Right.
It resonates with it.
Historical trauma being countered by historical healing.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
The things that we have.
Yeah.
The same with Sweat Lodge. I went to prison with my, well, I didn't go to prison. I went into the prison
Right.
with
Yeah.
my cousin who runs ceremonies for prisoners all over Oregon. And went into a sweat lodge with him, and same thing. He said, big tough guys, and just big boo-hoo, you know. But it's the same thing. That's something that we had before those things happened, so
Yeah.
we resonate to that.
Yeah.
The canoe journey on the northwest coast in 1990, they started with 2 canoes, and the 2 families that started that canoe, they started as an alcohol prevention for youth. They said, let's bring back something that will bring our families together. And so around the canoe, there's a lot of tradition, a lot of protocols. There's songs, dances, ways you have to behave and conduct yourself. And so you have a canoe family, and somebody starts drinking. So they go to that person and they tell them, you know, you can't do that and be part of this family. You have to take care of this, and we'll do anything we can to support you or help you. And when you're done with that, when you show that you can come back, we want you back in our family. Now that's so much different than going into treatment, just kind of slinking in. Right. and being, you know, you're weak-willed or something's wrong with you.
Right.
And then slinking back into your community. This is a family that's telling you what the problem is. They're helping you identify it. Then you face it, and they'll help you face it. They'll do things to help face it, but outside that family, because you put yourself outside there. And so there's that, what do you call that?
Yeah, you're ostracized.
Yeah,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But you can come back if you take care of things. And being a part of that family feels so good that people started wanting to do that. And so they do that and come back to the family. So today, there's way over 80 of those canoe families. And I went out on one of those canoes one time, and it's so different being out on that water. And
this is an ocean voyage?
Yeah,
okay.
Out on the ocean, and they're not huge canoes.
No.
You know, 8, 12 people.
Mm-hmm.
But you go out there and it's so different. And one of the things that they said is that by doing this, by going out on the water, things have started coming back. Songs, dances, ceremonies, things are coming back. The songs that are coming back, they hear them on the water while they're out there, but they're only coming through the children, not the adults.
Interesting.
Only coming through the children.
Okay.
So to me, that's those ancestors saying,
right.
We like what you're doing. We've been separated for whatever. We never lost anything. You know, people think we lost things. We never lost anything. It's still there. And so it's reconnecting that. And that's another thing Eduardo Duran says. Once we heal our ancestors, we heal ourselves, we heal our ancestors, start healing those hurts in the past. And so that's, to me, that's an indication. Another thing that happened, a friend of mine, started one of those first 2 canoe families. They went on a journey to Canada. And they do this every summer for 2 weeks. They go to some journey somewhere. And part of the protocol is the canoes come up right next to the shore, and they can't come ashore until the chief or the headman welcomes them and tells them they can come ashore. And they do that one at a time, and they sing songs back and forth and stuff like that. But there's a regular protocol. And then they have a big feast at night, and people do dances and just visit. And it's just really a good feeling, I guess. And so the chief said, I'm not going to be here much longer. And when I come back, I'm going to come back as a killer whale. Well, he died about a week later. And my friend showed me a picture, and it was a Polaroid or Kodak or whatever. But there was 2 canoes, and there's a whale, killer whale, right in between the canoes. And these 2 guys my friend was one of them, had their hand on them, and they were talking to that killer whale. That was that chief. And so we hear about those things in the past, and we think Indians are in the past. Those
Right.
things never left.
No, they're here.
And so by doing that, healing ourselves, like canoe family, taking care of your family, living a good life, using the traditions that we have, that's healing our ancestors, and that's what they're telling us. And so that's how we do that. We use our traditions, the things we had before that hurt, to heal ourselves.
Right. So recreating them wherever possible. It's very similar to what spent some time in Hawaiian Islands, and
Oh, yeah.
the whole Hokulea, you know, basically the journey from Hawaii to Tahiti and back. I mean, and the first time they tried that, I mean, there was alcohol and drugs on the voyage, and they never made it. Right? And then they decided, okay, we need to do this sober. We need to like listen to the songs. We need to like, you know, use, you know, the star charts, the old star charts of, you know, seashells and other things like that. And they made it there and back as a clean and sober cultural recreation voyage. So I mean, that kind of stuff is going on. So let me ask you deep, because we've covered, you know, some of the questions that was going to ask in terms of looking at, you know, historical trauma, unresolved grief, who suffers from these, how do you recognize some of the symptoms, and you've talked about how those symptoms show up, and what are some of the cultural cures, you know, in terms of what is now called community-defined evidence, because before, obviously, Western civilization didn't really look at this, didn't consider it real, so we had to basically, as people of color, look at our own healing systems and draw on the past. So, as an Indigenous scholar, what is your role in resolving historical trauma in your own life and that of your nation, and also for the people that come to you at the University of Oregon? Is that relevant? Because it occurs to me that it's not just us as Native people, African people, Hawaiians, people of color that have these historical traumas. White people have historical trauma too, that they ain't talking about. You know, and certainly a lot of these alcoholics who have, I mean, I've had, you know, the people who usually identify this, you know, are Celtic. They say, well, we're not part of Western civilization, and we had things like genocide and slavery, you know, imposed upon us by the English, and, you know, we're trying to, you know, relive our, you know, quote unquote pagan, Wiccan, whatever ways, you know, and recreate that. But there are other populations probably that have this kind of historical trauma and grief too. What about them?
Trying to think how to answer this. There's 5 stages to healing, and the first one is to identify what it really is that's hurting you. And so years ago, I did a series of 5 workshops on 5 different reservations in the Northwest called Healing Our Wounded Spirits.
Yes, those conferences, yeah.
And that's what we talked about.
Yeah.
We surfaced that. This is what's killing. It's not alcoholism. It's not diabetes. It's historical trauma, unresolved grief caused by genocide, oppression, and we need to call it that. Dr. Duran says in that DSMR, it ought to be acute and chronic reaction to genocide and oppression.
Yeah, but you know APA ain't down with that.
Yet. But that, you know, there's Indian people who say,
Yes,
well,
right.
they don't do that, then we need a DSMR
Right,
for directions.
and there's black people that have been working on, okay, we need to name racism and, you know, that kind of stuff as a mental illness too. So, yeah.
So anyway, with those workshops and the idea for that started way back in the 90s by me going in the mountains and praying and fasting and staying in the mountains. Certain things were revealed to me. I didn't understand them until this opportunity just fell in my lap. And so that's what was revealed to me. Identify what it is that's really hurting you. That's what those workshops were about. Some people got mad. Well, you got to tell us what the next step is. That's not what I was told to do. That's not the message I had.
Okay.
So the next step is to face the hurt And we're doing that in certain areas now in our communities. And then you release the tears, you wipe the tears, and you pick up the tears. And we're not there yet. But that's got to be different in every community. You can't have Indian or whatever historical trauma intervention. It has to be tribe by tribe. You can have the same process, but you can't have a cookie cutter kind of thing, or this is your book and this is how you do it. There's a process to it, but each community has to do it in their own. Each individual has to do it in their own way, because the things that we face sometimes are different, different orders, different severities.
And the vision that's given to you is going to be different for you, and it's going to be your way in particular. Yeah.
And I had to be true to that.
Yeah.
And so anyway, my role, that's what I did. I'm not sure what my role is past that. And, people, you got to do this, you got to do that. Well, I did what I was told.
Well, I mean, you described it. Okay, so, and I characterize the question as an indigenous scholar. So an indigenous scholar not only goes to the library to do a lit search. An indigenous scholar goes out on the land where there is, where you have to clear yourself and do your prayer and fasting. And then, the information is, to use a computer term, downloaded on you, and then you have to unpack it just like, the zip file. You may not understand all the intricacies of the program as it gets unpacked, but, the next steps does seem to unfold, and they're different things for different people.
And we see that in different places, in Hickory, Apache, in Nez Perce, in Colville, in Puyallup, in Nisqually, doing their own Healing Wounded Spirits conferences. They're doing it on their own. And that's what we wanted.
Good. Yeah.
So they're doing it on their own, and they're going past that. They're going past it with the canoe families. They're going past it with their own ceremonies or whatever. And that's what was intended. So that's.
How does your work in OIED relevant to that issue, or is it?
It is. Part of my role in the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity is to work with tribes. We've been working on an idea of a tribal college for years. We talk about a Native Studies program. We talk about a Center for Indigenous Cultural Survival. Now, those all can be good things or they can be bad things.
Yep.
A Native Studies program to study natives, or a Native Studies program that works with indigenous communities on issues that are important to them, teaching their children things that they need to know. There's a Sahaptin language class this term, or for 2 years, where for the first time at University of Oregon, I know they're already doing that here, but
on the other side of this wall, in fact, right now,
where they can get their language requirement met by an Indian language. But again, in teaching that language, and elders teaching that, and so there's a lot of cultural teachings behind that. It's not just like learning Latin or something. There's a lot of cultural things behind it. And a Center for Indigenous Cultural Survival, in my mind, should work with our Oregon tribes first. Work on issues that are important to those tribes, like language revitalization. The Umatilla tribe is doing a project where they're looking at the effects of global warming and other environmental things on their traditional foods, and trying to think what that's going to look like into the future, and thinking ahead, trying to save those traditional foods, because it's already been impacted. And so they're looking at that, so they're looking that far out into the future. That's indigenous studies to me. And that's what our children should have a chance to participate in and learn, because that's something that's useful to their people. So we're getting close.
Oh, yeah. So, what can individuals do, for example, you know, you're enrolled, I've been actually invited to enroll in my tribe. You know, I think, you know, for me personally, that's a mixed bag in terms of, you know, sovereignty issues, identity, etc. You know, coming up with my own solutions in response to, you know, historical trauma and all that kind of thing. A question comes up, you know, who decides who or what is Native? I mean, that's almost like, you know, we played around with the concept of, you know, in a previous show people talked about, well, there are certain people who are Indian makers, or well, whatever. Who decides that? Besides not just tribes deciding who that, how do you decide as a result of, because part of that historical trauma is people being separated from their nations and becoming lost ones. And then, you know, there are other people who, you know, kind of get attracted to the vibe and, yeah, I want to belong somewhere. And, you know, I was driving down the road and I saw this bumper sticker, you know, I was Indian before it was cool to be Indian, right? So who decides who or what is Native whether it's a study program officially or unofficially?
Okay,
that's a large question. We got 6 minutes to do that.
Two different questions,
yes.
too. Okay, so as far as who decides who is Native, that's part of sovereignty, and tribes decide that.
Yes.
One of the basic tenets of sovereignty is being able to decide who your membership is and determining that. For a lot of years, that was done by Bureau of Indian Affairs, and tribes have just started taking that back. So for that answer, it's simple for me. It's tribes decide. A lot of tribes are undergoing changes, making changes to deal with some of the issues you talked about. Kids being fostered out, full-bloods that were fostered out. There was a time when over 50% of our Indian kids were in foster homes.
Yeah.
And it's hard for them to come home.
Right.
If they can prove that lineage, they can be enrolled in the tribe. They're not always welcome. That's some different issues. But tribes decide who's a member of their tribes. That's who decides who Indian is.
Okay.
What is Native? That's a stickier question. I'll give you an example. At the University of Oregon, it says we have 480 students.
Mm-hmm.
I know we don't have 480 students. And so...
Because it's self-identification.
It's self-identification. Yeah. And some people make an honest mistake because it doesn't say, it should say American Indian, Alaska Native, but it says Native American, so some people, I was born in America, that makes me a Native American. So semantically they're right, and they check it off. Other people want the benefits of being Native American, and other people are. And so, but what happens with that is that we get statistics from registrar's office that says our Indian students drop out in their junior year. And so for planning, if they want to put resources somewhere, they put it in our junior year.
Yeah.
So that's for the 400 students. Now what our tribes say is that our students drop out in their freshman year.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes self-identification makes it impossible for us to do any planning. And if they are doing planning and they put those resources in the junior year, it's not going to help our students who are dropping out in their freshman year.
Yeah.
So what is Native? That's what identification. Another thing, in a classroom, same thing, a person that identifies themselves as a Native American teaching a Native American class.
Mm-hmm.
So, talking about sovereignty, you have somebody that might be teaching a class that's never exercised sovereignty and doesn't know what that is. To be out and dig roots or pick berries or fish or hunt as part of your subsistence and what that means to you. What sovereignty means academically means something different on the land. And so we have that issue also, and we have people that are doing that. The other thing that does when we have non-Indians teaching or on our faculty and staff, the same thing happens. The university says, well, we've got these Native faculty, we don't need any more numbers.
Yeah, right.
And so there's that issue of teaching things that are not correct and we have to undo later. And also not getting people, what do you call that? Critical mass.
Yes.
Of
right.
people in there that can make some real change in Native studies and centers and things like that.
Any final thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you for inviting me, and yeah, that's it.
It's been good having you, because we could actually go for a lot longer, and we're coming up to the end of the show, and so there's a lot more that could be talked about in terms of like the tribal college, and I hope to have you back in terms of looking at some of those issues in an expanded way.
Thank you.
If you've liked what you've seen or have questions or comments, send an email to liveclass@lanecc.edu, put DiversiTV in the subject line, and tell a friend about this show. And we basically broadcast every Wednesday from 6 to 7, and there is a rebroadcast, which we should put at the end of the show at some point. You will be able to take this class for credit next term. This show will be part of the curriculum. And next week we'll be having a representative from the Anglo community talking about diversity from their point of view. This has been DiversiTV. I'm Mark Harris. Thank you. Go well, stay well.